What was Mao doing? And what were the Soviets doing when they implemented socialism, state socialism? What were they actually doing? Were they building something from scratch? No. We are going to talk about Deng Xiaoping. Why is Deng Xiaoping correct? Every day I realize how correct Deng Xiaoping was. And I want you to go back to what I was talking about when I was talking about nuclear war, because this is related. When I was talking about my villain of someone who wanted to destroy the world in order to redeem meaning in it. Creating something fundamentally outside of individuals, outside of interpretation and perception, an objective externality in which we are all compelled to experience the same reality by force through an actual apocalypse. So this begs the question. This is what we're going to get at. What if the same thing... let's go back to the problem of communication. Now, one's if you remember what the problem of communication is. Two's if you don't. Three's if you're mentally retarded and your thumb is up your ass and you're picking your boogers in your nose and your sweaty Cheeto-stained fingers won't even allow you to answer because you don't even know what I'm referring to at all. Okay. Well, to refresh your memory, I know you guys have the memory of birds. You have a bird-brained memory. You have the memory of birds. So I have to refresh your memory. The problem of communication is the fact that there's a disconnect between the inputs and the outputs. The input being all of our intentions, all of the things we use to formulate meaning. The output being how that meaning is interpreted by society. That's the problem or by other people in general. That's the problem of communication. The fact that it seems like we don't share any reality at the level of bilateral communication between two parties, right? That's the problem of communication. So what if I told you the problem of communication is the same thing as the problem of communism? Now, the Austrians talked about the calculation problem, which is the thing, but that's just another word for the problem of communication. Instead of a problem of calculation, it's actually a problem of communication. A communist society cannot prove any common sociality on the terms of the Communist Party itself. The Communist Party cannot decide how we are social or how we have a common reality. And the intentions of the socialist planners or the socialist leaders to build socialism radically differ from the actual outcome. So the problem of communication that I gave you is this. You say you have an intention, but when you say it, it comes out differently than what you intended. The problem of communism is kind of what right-wingers say, right? When you set about to the task of building it, it turns out radically different from what you intended. It's the same shit. You guys see how it's the same shit? Or do I have to explain it? The difference between the intention and the result. The problem of communication and the problem of communism, and when I say communism, I'm not using it in a theoretically loaded way for all the people who may have a developmental disorder or maybe on the spectrum or have autism. Just to be clear, I'm being inclusive and neurologically diverse in the stream. I'm talking about communism in the ordinary colloquial sense of the word. The problem with communism and the problem of communication are the same exact thing. What Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening it up accomplishes, first and foremost, is an acknowledgement that the pace of socialist construction escapes the purview of socialist consciousness. The pace of socialist construction is irreducible to socialist consciousness. Socialist consciousness is actually derivative and secondary with regard to the material scale of time at which socialist construction occurs. Within the linear temporality of modern time, right? Modern temporality, there is an actual connection between consciousness, not just ideology, but just consciousness in general, and the scale of time, the scale at which time proceeds. This takes the form of, like the Big Ben clock in London, the clock, right? The clock hand, the mechanical clock. The extent of our perception of time is synonymous with the concept we have of time that exists in our consciousness. We measure time according to whatever the solar revolutions, and we divide these down to seconds or milliseconds or however we want to. Just almost like a digital clock, right? And it's just moving. And it's moving at the exact same pace as our consciousness of it. What if I imposed or raised the idea that time moves at a scale that is not continuous with our consciousness of it? Then we are returning to pre-modern time or postmodern time, depending on how you want to look at it. But this is a form of temporality, and this is a form of time that is very much implicit in modern socialist China. In modern socialist China, the pace of socialist construction is happening at a level that is not reducible to the socialist consciousness that exists. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? It means that within the process of the development of socialism, all sorts of immoral, unjust, non-pleasing, unacceptable even, things are happening at the level of our individual conscious experience. For example, if you want to think about this outside of the context of China, think about it in terms of multipolarity. There was a recent controversy that Samira started or created because she was endorsing and celebrating arms deals and increased diplomatic relations between China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. So Deng Xiaoping, right? He, okay, Arthur, are you actually retarded? It's like I'm on a rocking chair and nobody can shut the fuck up about it. Nervous rock. So now we're going to do psychoanalysis when I'm rocking on the rocking chair. Every time I rock on the rocking chair, there's got to be psychoanalysis now. That's the internet. That's why I'm saying the world deserves to end. I genuinely believe because of something as small as that, that proves the world should end. It is so far from this fucking armchair analysis, armchair psychology alone justifies the end of the world. Nuclear extinction is justified by how fucking stupid you are. And I'm not kidding. You think I'm joking and I'm not. This isn't a fiction anymore. I actually believe it. I actually believe that. It's not a joke. You think I'm joking and I'm not. I said it was a good fictional idea, and now it's not fiction anymore. I'm saying let it rain hellfire on the world. Let it all come to an end. We deserve it. I don't deserve it, but you do, and I'm willing to sacrifice. I'll go down with it if it's worth it to me. If it means an end to the level of stupidity you have just demonstrated for all of us to see, it's actually worth it to me. If it means an end to that. If it means sweet, sweet release from such a fucking abject level of stupidity, we deserve it. We actually do deserve it. And I welcome it. And I will, as the sky flares up in a flash of fire and fucking whatever event horizon, I will fucking smile as my fucking skin is churned away from my face and I melt and dissolve into ashes. The last thing you will find from me is a fucking smile. That will be the last thing I give to this world, is a smile, knowing all of this has ended and there is sweet release from this cosmic level of stupidity. So Deng Xiaoping, we're going to fucking go back to what I was saying. If you want to think about this from the perspective of multipolarity, think about it in terms of the arms deal between China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. And why are we supporting that? How could you support that? Look at all the injustice Saudi Arabia inflicts. We know. I'm a Shia. I know about that. Saudi Arabia executes Shia. We all know about that. And yet I'm praising this. Oh my God, how could China have diplomatic relations with the U.S. in the Cold War after all the things U.S. did? China's complicit, according to the leftists, in the injustice of the world. Complicit. We're all complicit, though. And there's an event horizon of extinction beyond which the modern subject does not possess any faculty of perception that establishes a fundamental difference between our experience and intervention into reality at the level of consciousness and the way in which reality is actually developing at the material and social level. If you can understand this difference, you can understand anything about infrared. If you can understand this difference. There's a difference between the development of reality and our experience of reality and our intervention into reality at the level of our rational consciousness. Our intervention in the reality is based on will. Our expression of will is an extension of our rational consciousness. You make choices based on your consciousness. Our experience of reality is filtered. The way we judge reality is based on our rational consciousness. All of these things are individual. They happen at the level of a sovereign individual subject. They happen at a conscious level, and we experience them in an immediate way. For example, take the way in which most communists interpret the meaning of praxis. I want to change the world and build socialism. So I'm going to go run out on the street and do things because I need to experience the construction of socialism in a way that is immediately and cotemporal with my experience and intervention in reality as an individual person. But as I have just demonstrated, or at least alluded to, if I haven't demonstrated it yet, there's one, a problem of communication, and two, a problem of communism, in which our intentions at the level of our faculties of reason, which we give expression to consciously, radically differ from their outcomes and their actual consciousness when they are given expression in reality. Theory and praxis differ. When you implement theory in reality, it turns out to be something radically different than your theory. That's what Marx made very clear as a materialist. So what does this mean at the level of socialist construction? When we build socialism, are we doing so according to a conscious, rational plan or even ideal or idea in which we build a society according to what we think is moral, just, ideologically correct, etc.? Or does the temporal scale of socialist construction and the development of socialist construction happen in a way that is radically discontinuous with our conscious, rational experiences? According to Deng Xiaoping, it's the latter which is the case. So this should be your question. Your question should be, okay, Haas, granted all of that. Why is it still socialism then? Why isn't the outcome something radically different from the original intention of socialist construction? Why even still call it socialism if the outcome is so radically different? Because even though the development of socialism in China gave rise to an inadvertent consequence, which was not created by Deng and his policies, by the way, the consequence being this reemergence of some kind of socialist commodity form in the case of Stalin's building of socialism, or in the case of China, the way in which the people's commune system gave rise to a new form of exchange value and some new form of the value form. And when left communists said that, in some sense they were right. There was a new reemergence of the value form, both in the Soviet Union and China, which seems like an inadvertent consequence of socialist construction. But it's not inadvertent from a retrospective perspective. But if you perceive socialist construction to be reducible to its development at an individual conscious level, then yes, it is. But if you recognize the pace of socialist construction to be beyond individual consciousness and rational consciousness, you start to treat the socialist mode of production as a material thing, an objective material thing. If it's an objective material thing, it's like a hyper object. Let me illustrate this to you in a different way. On the ground, and you see Godzilla, or you see some kaiju, it's too fucking big to see the whole thing. When Godzilla is walking, he's too fucking big to see all of him walking at once. You're just going to see his big ass thighs or his leg because he's too big for your individual experience to perceive him. So in the theoretical tradition, the school that was called object-oriented ontology, that's what you would call a hyper-object. It's an object of our perception whose consistency goes beyond the bounds of our phenomenal experience. Another example of a hyper-object would be, for example, a geological development that occurs at a time scale of millions and millions of years. It's a real object, it's happening, but we cannot perceive anything happening because the scale at which it develops is so radically heterogeneous with the scale of time we experience as human beings. I am just saying the development of socialism is exactly like that. And that is Deng Xiaoping's achievement, is articulating this fact within Marxist-Leninism. Deng Xiaoping thought, in part, amounts to the contribution of this acknowledgement within Marxist-Leninist theory. Socialist construction is happening at a scale imperceptible to the immediate modern consciousness that experiences an immediate linear development of time. Now, why am I bringing up linear? Am I just trying to confuse you or obfuscate what I'm talking about? No. I'm bringing up linear time specifically because the alternative to linear time, which is hard for people to think about, concerns the fact that sometimes in material reality, a thing is already there or already exists or is already materially real first, and then its development is something we experience at the level of individual consciousness. For example, an example of non-linear temporality would be the Terminator movies, where the future already has happened, and they send someone back in time to develop that future, to ensure that it happens, or maybe even ensure that it happens in a different way. Also, the phenomena of retroaction in quantum mechanics and retrocausality, which I've talked about before in quantum mechanics. These are all examples of temporality that are non-linear. And non-linear temporality is relevant here specifically because linear time within modernity also corresponds to the immediate experience of time corresponding to time itself. Time only flows in one direction, and that direction just so happens to be one that is immediate, that is contemporaneous and co-temporal with the flow of our experience. So the same flow of experience we have, we measure that in terms of time. But the flow of our experience is not the only reality. Our experience of reality and reality are not exactly the same. It's part of reality, sure, but there's a discontinuity between them. Obviously there is. If there wasn't, we would not be able to think about any kind of reality that cannot, for example, we wouldn't even be able to think of the sun. Because, of course, the sun is imperceptible as an object if we reduce it to the frame of reference, which is our experience. We couldn't think about things like the speed of light, which obviously could not be experienced at the level of, etc., etc. We wouldn't be able to engage in modern physics with all of its complicated mathematical formulae, which clearly refer to something non-empirical. When I say something non-empirical, I just mean impossible to observe. Not only is it not a result of observation, you could not observe this. It's just beyond the bounds of human experience. It's somewhere in the real that can only be translated into the abstract terms of mathematics. So this is what I mean by outside of linear temporality. But modernity involves one tyranny of time. That is linear time. Linear, immediate, individual time. The time on your stopwatch. If there is a scale of temporal development occurring at a level heterogeneous with the scale of temporal development that we can experience as human beings, we're in for a wild, wild ride, aren't we? That means Lovecraft is correct. There are old ones exerting their influence on the world of humanity from without. Thank you, Chris Morlock.
In physics, we call it the measurement problem.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. So what does it mean to acknowledge this at the level of socialist consciousness? And again, why still call it socialism? Because scientific socialism specifically, and Marxism, which is why Deng Xiaoping is not a revisionist, but is merely elaborating Marxism-Leninism to its conclusion and has been doing that, is because of the following. Socialism, conceived as a mode of production that reflects the reality of the socius, that the socius exerts its significance as the driving force of the mode of production. According to scientific socialism, that is something materially real. That is a reality that is not created voluntarily, but which is itself a consequence of the development of the capitalist mode of production. Meaning it's a materially real reality. It just has to be acknowledged according to a consciousness based not in morality, not in a utopian vision for an ideal society, but in a consciousness of necessity. Socialism is a necessity for no other reason than the fact that it is a material reality. Many people think socialism is necessary to save the planet, or it's necessary to prevent some harm, or it's necessary to alleviate poverty, or it's necessary for some other reason. That means it's not necessary at all. That means you are choosing socialism to fulfill a different necessity, a moral one or a rational one, whatever. But that's not scientific socialism according to Marx and Engels. That is not scientific socialism. Scientific socialism means you perceive the development of socialism in reality itself, and you only articulate that and give form to it in consciousness. Sorry, you recognize its form in consciousness, however one you want to look at. What was Mao doing? And what were the Soviets doing when they implemented socialism, state socialism? What were they actually doing? Were they building something from scratch? No. They were not. So you see, socialism had already happened when the Soviets and the Chinese were building it. How did it already happen? The specific understanding of the economy as something that possesses significance at the political level, at the discursive level. Fuck it, why not, right? That is something that had been made real in material reality itself. The space with which this continent of conscious intervention could be exhumed and explored already happened before. It became possible to build a socialist economy with state socialist institutions only because the economy itself became real at a different level. Because the economy itself, proper, the real material economy, was pushed to a scale outside the device of modern consciousness. That means all of the aspects of state socialism that existed in the Soviet Union and in China and other communist states, that was not the actual economy proper. That was an aspect of modern state political consciousness or political intervention that had already been opened up according to a more fundamental change at the economic level. State socialism was just an epicycle of some other economic material development that could not proceed according to a plan. The economy is always something you cannot plan for. Planning, as Engels described it, doesn't refer to a determination of the economy as a result or extension of political will, but rather more like a steering, almost more like a cybernetic conception, if you want, right? A science of direction, something that is already moving, already going in a certain direction, and like the great helmsman, you're just steering it, right? That is more what planning is referring to, rather than creating from scratch. So state socialist planning in the Soviet Union and in China did not actually encompass the whole of the economy. The state planning was a moment within the actual material economy that had developed. The economy is always material. That's why it's called an economy. If it wasn't material, that is discontinuous and non-transparent, the device of modern rational consciousness, it would not be an economy. An economy. There would be no divided oikos, no divided ecos to begin with. There'd be no need for there to be an economy because it wouldn't be discontinuous from politics to begin with. Economy proper refers to a science and law of humanity's interaction with nature and distribution of the products of that interaction thereof. Production and distribution. A science of this that proceeds according to its own laws and its own development. It's not an extension of politics. It's actually a reality more primary than politics is. Thank you, Chris Morlock.
Do you think Deng and many Chinese Marxists were influenced by Schelling and Fichte's natural philosophy?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I haven't heard anything like that. I haven't read any evidence of that. So I couldn't tell you, but that's an interesting idea. That's an interesting theory. What was the ultimate significance of socialist construction within the Soviet Union and China? Was it bureaucratic central state planning? No! Bureaucratic central state planning was already a material reality of imperialism. It was certainly a reality of the post-war Bretton Woods American globalist economy. That is not what distinguished Soviet socialism. That is certainly not what distinguished Chinese socialism. What distinguished Soviet socialism was the kolkhoz. It was a sphere of economy outside of state socialism. Same with China. The People's Commune was also outside of central state socialism. And by central state socialism, I mean not proceeding according to a central plan. It was an economic unit that formed not according to a central plan, but according to the immediate necessities of economic life, therein allowing the breathing room and the space for economic laws to assert themselves independently of the voluntary control of the central state. And somehow that was still socialist. somehow that was still socialist. Somehow, when Stalin and Mao acted as libertarians, the economy was still socialist. When they allowed the state to be hands-off in some sphere, the kolkhoz or the People's Commune, it was still socialist. Why was it socialist? Because of the relation between these units and the central state plan. The relation being one of exchange, which at the same time produced a surplus product that was economized in a social way. The surplus product of the relation, or of production in general, was economized in a social way, economically, not because of a political plan. This speaks to the reality of a socialist mode of production that is not reducible to political planning. Even if it involves political planning, it's not reducible to it. Deng Xiaoping's greatness lied in his ability to unleash that reality of the socialist economy. So the problem of communism, or the problem of communication, is resolved only in the acknowledgement of a third element, or a third point of reference, between the relationship of the central socialist state and the socialist economic units of society. That third element being a material reality of the socius. Because in the relationship between the central socialist state and the socialist civil society, there's an accidental byproduct. There's an inadvertent consequence of the central plan. That inadvertent consequence cannot transparently reflect the initial aims or inputs of socialist production. There's an inadvertent result. The only way in which this inadvertent result can acquire rationality, and by rationality I just mean consistency as part of some coherent, rational reality, not just some chaotic, meaningless one, is insofar as it is recognized that the object of production, the actual site of the socialist economy, is beyond the threshold, beyond the scope of direct planning, yet still socialistic. This, my friends, is the meaning of a socialist accelerationism. Accelerate the forces of production like a ruthless libertarian capitalist, but actually that mode of production is already socialist. So by accelerating it, you're just accelerating the development of socialism. That's what it means for socialism to be material. And that's what it means for socialist construction to occur at a level beyond modern time. The dilemma of Ilyenkov, of the fact that we cannot have a socius outside of what appears to be the annihilation of the world, because here we are individuals. You're an individual, I'm an individual. Where are we in common? Ilyenkov says we are in common in this collective act of self-sacrifice, at least at the cosmic level. That's the only place we are in common. Deng Xiaoping thought exists beyond the threshold of Ilyenkov's self-sacrificial apocalypse. The reason it exists beyond the threshold of this apocalypse is because it amounts to a recognition that even though, thank you DC, even though our socius is not here in the direct relation between an individual's will and other individuals, or even at the level of the voluntary association of individuals, there is a materially real socius that in a Asiatic way is a fatal Asiatic way, if you want to be Orientalist, is acknowledged in the terms of historical necessity, or in the terms of material socialist development, or in the terms of unleashing the productive forces. Deng Xiaoping's unleashing of the productive forces amounts to the aftermath of Ilyankov's apocalypse. It is post-apocalyptic, where Ilyankov cannot perceive any reality outside of this apocalypse in which we are actually human beings in common. That reality is already taken for granted in socialism with Chinese characteristics. Hence, films, for example, like Wandering Earth, that depict this directly. The Wandering Earth is a post-apocalyptic world. Yet it's also a world that, if you watch the movie, eerily resembles an aestheticization of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And of course, The Wandering Earth, if you don't know the details of that film, is not just wandering aimlessly in space. It is, in a mathematically precise way, calculated to reach a new solar system in how many millions of light years or something. It's not just wandering in empty space. Just because you can't see the new sun doesn't mean you're not going in its direction. Just because you cannot see socialism in the immediate sense in China doesn't mean China is not being characterized by the development of a socialist mode of production. China dwells in not only a different world as a space, but a different time than the West and America. China dwells in a place after the American apocalypse. China is the future. China is arriving to us from a future, but also a future that has already crossed the threshold of the end of America and the end of the modern West. China has taken for granted the destruction of the modern West. It has fulfilled the destruction of the modern West by virtue of its being. It has already taken that for granted. And it has developed according to a temporality of retrocausality. Now we have the Taliban to just fulfill this process. Taliban, or global Islam more generally, acting as China's Terminator. If China is Skynet, Taliban is the Terminator. China time travels? Literally, yes. China, by virtue of its existence, has been time traveling. If you want a literary expression of this fact, just read Nick Land's tour guides for tourists. Read his book, Templexity, and you'll see Chinese time travel in action. What future is the Taliban bringing forth? China, the one that China has already taken for granted.